This is Dust, Documents and Diamonds, a podcast about history, researching history, and the joy of finding diamonds when we search the archives for the dust of past lives. So, elections. Let's take a break from the horrors of the 2024 general election and talk about elections in something more like 1624, when they had different problems. And actually, to talk about that, I'm here with another historian, Dr Simon Healy, who was a research fellow for many years at the History of Parliament Trust and has his doctorate from the University of London on the subject of the politics of Crown finance.
Indeed.
Elections in the pre-modern period. And first of all, unlike now, parliaments didn't happen all the time. There wasn't a parliament in session all the time.
By no means. The reason why parliaments are now in permanent session is because Parliament realised after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that the best way of perpetuating themselves was to vote the government finances for a single year at a time. Then Parliament has to be kept on calling back to renew the Finance Act, which is why the Chancellor delivers a budget every year.
So, but before that system was established, why did the Crown call a Parliament?
Well, there were several reasons. The first and most obvious one was, as today, to vote money. Lots of it, always much more money than people really wanted to vote. The second one was to pass new laws relating to national local administration, relating to religion, because Parliament was summoned to discuss religion as well as anything else that it might consider. Yeah. Or, of course, to discuss reforms to the legal system, things like that. And the third thing is that it was also understood that the Crown needed to let local communities have a say in passing legislation for their own local or even personal benefit, for the benefit of individuals or communities.
Okay, yes, because of course the English Reformation couldn't be done without Parliament. No. Henry VIII knew that right from 1529.
This realm of England is an empire, as the act in the breach with Rome started, yes.
Okay, so this is why the king would call a parliament. Why would people want to sit in Parliament? Why be an MP?
There are a number of reasons, and of course it varies from person to person. But the one which, well, there are two that apply generally. The first one is that people stood for Parliament to promote their own personal interests or their wider community's interests. They would always dress it up as being their wider community interest. Yep. The other one is, of course, that it's a great way of demonstrating your social standing if your contemporaries vote you into Parliament, particularly for a county seat or one of the larger borough seats. There are, however, all sorts of other reasons why you might want to stand. The first one is that if you have a borough which you control most of the interest in, you just want to keep the seat warm, basically. Even if you don't want to stand yourself, you don't have a son who's old enough to stand for you, you still want to keep it warm, and so you'll dish it out to one of your friends and relatives. And of course, by that token, also Crown servants, ministers and bureaucrats, want to get into Parliament to be able to promote the government's legislative agenda, and there are various seats. The Crown holds interest in various seats, and also has other people willing to hand on their own interests to the Crown servants to get into Parliament. There are also two more minor reasons why, but it's also a consideration. The first one is that great noblemen often like to put their eldest son, sometimes even some of their younger sons, into Parliament. It's a means of rounding off their political education. They may only be in their 20s, they may sometimes even be in their teens. Theoretically, you're not allowed to stand unless you're over 21, but that rule was bent for sons of noblemen. And the other reason, which one should always remember, there's always half a dozen people in every Parliament who are being pursued by their creditors and are under threat of arrest for debt. Right. And being an MP gives you immunity from prosecution.
Goodness me. Right. Okay. So you spoke just about county seats and borough seats. So I just want to just to clarify, who's actually in Parliament? Now we know that Parliament consists of King, Lords and Commons.
Correct.
Hence the phrase, it is enacted by the King in Parliament, or the Queen in Parliament.
Yes.
So it consists of King, Lords and Commons. Now we know in the House of Lords you have the peers, the hereditary peers. How many of them roughly usually?
It depends how vicious the crown was being. Sometimes in the Middle Ages it could get up to well over 100. But after the cull mounted by the Tudors, it got down to, and the cull, and also Elizabeth didn't like creating peers, it got down to about 60 or so.
So by cull you mean unfortunate political executions?
Accidents involving the sharp end of an axe, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yes.
But also how...
Death in combat and so on.
Yes, and death in battle or just the line dying out.
Yes.
Yeah, but also how generous the crown is being at the moment about creating new peerages. Okay, so that could be a few dozen peers, and also the bishops.
And there were
the Church of England.
there were 22 bishops before the Reformation, and another 4 bishoprics were created after the Reformation, and they were all ex officio in Parliament,
and those are
the House of Lords.
The Lords Spiritual.
And there were also before the Reformation, there were also half a dozen abbots of the major wealthy abbeys, whose income was equivalent to any baron of the realm.
Yeah, because they were big landowners, the abbeys,
yes,
and therefore represented potentially a very large interest. And there were of course no life peers.
No,
and
life peers are an invention of the post-war period. In fact.
Yeah, and
That's
certainly
the Second World War period.
and so no kind of direct political appointees or
no,
nothing.
Well,
like that.
they were insofar as the crown could create new peerages, but then when they die and their sons take over, it's anybody's guess as to whether they're going to toe the line. In fact, James I and Charles I peerage creations most notably flocked to fight with Parliament in the Civil War. Right.
Because once you create a hereditary peerage, you then have no control, obviously,
exactly.
over who inherits it. So, and in the House of Commons, which we're mainly talking about today,
the House of Commons was quite anomalous in the European context. Firstly, some parliaments in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, had a house of peers and bishops and townsmen and peasants. There was never a house of peasants in the English system.
Right.
But the House of Commons includes a bunch of different types of people. The first one was that every shire, and there are 40 shires in England, and later on the dozen Welsh shires got enfranchised as well. And they had the English shires, the 40 English shires, got to return 2 knights of the shire. They were called MPs for the county.
Right. So there are the county members, the knights of the shire. Okay.
They were generally pretty substantial men. When James I started dishing out peerages, quite a few knights of the shire got a peerage. And in many of the...
At which point they would stop being
they'd obviously
members of the House of Commons,
But they... in Europe, quite a lot of these greater gentry would have ended up sitting with the peers. For instance, in the French Estates General, they sat with the peers.
But keeping it to England, so you have the Knights of the Shire, and those are in a way the most prestigious seats.
Very much so.
But as well as these county MPs, as it were, you also have the boroughs.
Yes, there are many boroughs get enfranchised over time.
That means you're allowed to return an MP. Yeah.
No, you're allowed to return 2 MPs.
2. Okay.
A handful of very small boroughs were only given 1 MP when they were franchised,
right.
But almost all of them were given 2 MPs.
Okay.
So you're always voting for 2 people at any given election. Mm-hmm. Apart from anything, I think there are many reasons why that should be, but I think one of the reasons is it defuses contests. If you've got two powerful local families vying for superiority in their local area, then the fact you've got two seats means usually, if you're lucky, they can agree to split them.
Okay, and roughly how many borough constituencies were there?
Well, this varied because, of course, the House of Commons is continually growing. The Crown keeps on enfranchising more boroughs.
Well, let's pick a date.
They were saying around 1500, there would have been about 220 borough members, which is, say, 110 constituencies.
Okay. Around 1600?
And around 1600, that's pretty much doubled.
Okay.
Sorry, but by the eve of the Civil War, that's pretty much doubled.
By 1642, just before the Civil War, we're talking more like 450.
Something like that.
Right.
Well, we're talking, the Commons is almost at 500 when the Civil War breaks out. They've enfranchised half a dozen constituencies in the 2 years leading up to the war.
Okay, cool. So, we're talking about 500 members of the House of Commons, some of whom are these Knights of the Shire, about 80, and then the others are borough MPs.
Yes.
And usually 2 per borough, per constituency. Okay, good. Just to go quickly through the sort of mechanics, how was a parliament summoned?
Well,
what actually happened?
First, the king decides he wants to summon a parliament. As I say, it's usually because of the money. He needs some money, possibly legislative reform as well.
Okay.
And so he has the Lord Chancellor send out writs of summons. Now, each of the peers gets a writ of summons, a personal writ of summons to them by name. And he keeps a list of the, it's called a parliament pawn. He keeps a list of the people who are summonable. And the only people who are excluded from those summons for the peers are ones who are underage, under the age of 21, or, of course, mad, which a few of them occasionally are. You'll find that a surprise, I know. But though sometimes when a peer was only a few months short of his 21st birthday, they would send out a summons to him anyway.
Okay, as an early birthday
present.
Yes,
that's right. Bishops, of course, don't have most of these problems. Some of them may have been as mad as a hatter, but they generally get some.
Okay, right.
Okay,
so that's the Lords, and then for the Commons...
For the Commons, there are a number of different franchises, a number of different electorates. The Shire Knights...
But the mechanics of sending out the summons.
Yes, of course. Then each constituency that is enfranchised has a writ of summons sent out to the sheriff of the county, and he then sends them out to the borough constituencies, the towns, that are also enfranchised. He then sends a subordinate writ, and in the towns, it's whoever heads the town's government, which might be a mayor, it might be a bailiff, it might just be the local reeve.
Tax collector.
Yeah.
The reeve. Yeah. Okay. The reeve is the tax collector, right? And they will then sort of organise.
And they will then hold a meeting, and they will return their member.
Right. So just to clarify, it goes from the king to the Lord Chancellor to the sheriff of the county to the heads of the various towns, and then an election is held. And then
they send returns. There were all sorts of arguments in the 14th century about who actually had been returned, and so they eventually, in 1430, there was an act passed saying that you had to send in an indenture, a proper deed. It was a deed between the returning officer on the one hand and the voters, or at least a representative sample of the voters. I mean, it was if it ran to thousands, you wouldn't have them all signed. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the MPs are elected. So that brings us on to who were the voters. Well,
there were sometimes a huge number of them, and other times not.
Okay.
For the counties, for the Knights of the Shire, the election was in the 40-shilling freeholders, and it was set thus in the early 15th century again.
Yeah.
It was defined as this because 40-shilling freeholder was liable to pay the Crown's taxes.
Right.
And so, therefore, what you're talking about is an electorate of taxpayers. It's an electorate. It's always an electorate. It's an electorate of heads of household, because of course they're the ones who are liable for the tax. They're paying their whole family's tax.
Okay.
it's not. But the shires. Well, back in the beginning of the 15th century, there was 40 shillings was quite a bit.
Right.
A 40 shilling freehold.
So a 40 shilling freehold, just to clarify, means that you own or hold land which brings an income of at least 40 shillings a year.
Property.
It
could be land, it could be a house.
Okay.
It might even actually be an office. If it was a government office that was salaried, it might be a government office.
It must be worth 40 shillings a year.
Yes, precisely. 40 shillings is quite a lot in 1400.
But by 1600...
But by 1600 it's nowhere near as much. In fact, anybody who was farming 20 acres could justifiably claim to be a 40 shilling freeholder, unless it was really scrubby mountainous country.
And they include leases. So if you hold a lease,
it came to be understood. Obviously, anybody who has a freehold, they're qualified as a voter. But it came to be understood that people who held a lease for their life, would also, they have a life interest. The important thing is your voice can't be commanded by your landlord. He can't say, vote for me or I'll throw you out.
That's interesting for, to think about the at least theoretical freedom of the voters. Okay,
yes.
So the vote is based on property.
So, yes, now, that's the counties. In the boroughs, it's also based on property, but it's based on all sorts of different qualifications.
Just a moment. So what you're saying is there isn't one rule nationally about the franchise. The franchise, who can vote, is different in different constituencies.
The only rule that is established is that it's 40 shilling freehold qualification for the counties.
But the boroughs,
it
can all be
depends on local custom.
Right, that's really interesting, because I mean it's something that, like, today just sounds absurd. We would think it's absurd that it should be, a postcode lottery whether or not you get the vote.
Yes.
But why do they think it's okay? Is it some sense that, in a way, I don't know, it's a sense of local autonomy, that, like, the king commands the borough to return a member of parliament, but it's kind of not his business how the borough chooses to choose that person?
Yes, that pretty much sums it up. I think that is the general feeling. Yeah. Right.
So just give a couple of examples of the different ways a borough might determine who can vote.
At the top end, the really big towns, London, York, Bristol, Norwich, big places like that, they almost invariably had a vote. They gave the vote to the freemen, which is to say, if you're a freeman of the borough, you're entitled to run a business in the town. You pay rates, of course, for that privilege, but you're entitled to run a business. So lots of shopkeepers and people like that, really fairly humble people by the standards of the day. But but there are also quite a large number of these people.
Just to be clear, when we say freeman, we mean you have a sort of, you're free of the town, as in you have a sort of citizenship of the town. We're not talking about freemen versus slaves or something.
No.
Right. So just to be clear. Right.
Then you have, also below that, you have, often in many towns, the small, medium-sized towns, you have a burgage vote. A burgage is a property, a house. It's not always a house. In Droitwich, which was a big salt manufacturing town, the burgages were actually salt pans.
Right. So if you own a salt pan,
that's where all the money came from. So there's no reason why they shouldn't enfranchise the salt pans.
Right.
But yes, so now a designated number of burgages have the vote. Sometimes it's pretty much everyone. But sometimes it's only specific burgages. You get down to the famous case of Old Sarum, the
quintessential rotten borough,
the pocket borough, yes, which has 9 burgage properties that convey the vote. Now, by the reign of James I, these had all been bought up by the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Salisbury, and so
there's 2 voters.
So, effectively, yes.
Right.
Well, there's 2 people who nominate people. Right. There are 9 voters, but they will be sensible enough to oblige the Earls of Pembroke and Salisbury usually.
Right.
And so
Doesn't that go against the theory you mentioned earlier that if you're a freeholder whose vote cannot be ordered by your landlord?
Ah, you noticed. Yes, it does. But that's the point. The proprieties have to be observed, or to be seen to be observed, but they don't necessarily go. They're free and unfettered voters, not necessarily the lot of everyone. The deal is, though, for a small borough like this, like Old Sarum, and there are several others that have voters in the single figures. The deal is that the MPs almost invariably promise they will serve without wages. Because, oh yes, MPs got wages, but they weren't paid by the government.
Right.
You see, people 500 years ago have been horrified by the idea the government pays them MPs.
Yeah.
And, you know, the government pays them, then surely
they're the government servants.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
So they're actually paid by their constituents. And
Fair
there is,
enough.
in the
They're
early
representing
15th
the
century,
constituents.
the Court of Exchequer.
Does that mean that if you thought your MP was doing a rubbish job, you could like dock his salary, pay him less?
You might choose not to pay him at all. Mind you, there is a writ de expenses to pay for expenses.
Yeah.
And an MP can move for this, and it's pretty hard to get out of it. But basically, yes, if you're a burgage holder, you're a ratepayer almost certainly in the town, then you have to pay rates for your MP. And the deal is, you get two shillings and sixpence a day expenses if you're a borough representative.
Yeah.
If you're a knight of the shire, you get 4 shillings a day, because of course they're bigger people, aren't they? They're more expenses. And plus also travel expenses to and from Parliament.
Okay, so we've talked about the franchise being based on various rules about property and so on. Did women vote?
Sometimes yes.
Okay.
Now, it's quite clear. It's quite difficult to establish cases where women vote are known to have actually turned up and cast their eye or nay for a particular candidate, though it does exist.
Okay.
We have the wonderful case of the borough of Gatton in Surrey, which is a very small borough.
Okay.
It's one property, which is owned by the Copley family. And when the head of the family dies in 1549, his widow takes over.
Right.
And she clearly returns an MP. There's a by-election a couple of years later, and she returns the MP in the normal family way, which is saying, I, Mr. Copley, or in her case, I, Lady Copley, return so-and-so and so-and-so as my MPs for the borough of Gatton.
Yeah.
Somebody clearly thought this was a little odd and had a word with her, because at the next election, the indenture reads, Lady Copley and the burgesses and boroughmen of the borough of Gatton return 2 MPs.
But the point is that the franchise was based on property.
Yes.
Now, a woman as a widow might own property.
A woman as a widow.
Or as a single woman, potentially. Only married women,
as a widow
definitively.
as an heiress, or as a widow with an underage male heir.
Yep.
Will exercise the control of the property as guardian for her underage son.
Okay. So women could exercise the vote if they qualified, if they met the property qualification.
Yes, and now this was not uncontested. At Knaresborough in 1621, there was a hard-fought election between 2 local worthies, one of whom was a townsman, one of whom owned the big park just outside the town.
Okay.
And the complaint, the townsman won, but the other man who was defeated, Henry Slingsby, he complained that the indenture had been signed on behalf of his opponent by 4 women. They said, well, we're perfectly entitled to. We're burgage holders.
Yeah.
You know, we hold rather than burgages. We're entitled to vote.
Yep.
And the Commons, I think, very wisely decided they wouldn't make a decision about this. They decided to go away. And the next election, 3 years later, the big gentleman, Sir Henry Slingsby, got his own back. He actually had 9 women and a clergyman sign his return. Clergymen are represented in the House of Convocation, so they're not in Parliament. So so it was decided. In fact, it was decided that no, he wouldn't get the seat, but that women perhaps shouldn't vote so obviously. Now, in fact, what happens in reality most of the time is that if you're a woman who owns a property that gives you the vote in a constituency, you just send a male relative or servant along to cast your vote for you, and everybody knows they're there as a proxy. That's perfectly acceptable. But you do it all without any fuss.
So it's interesting in a way because we all know about the history of women's struggle to win the vote, but in a way there's an interesting story
about how women lost the vote.
How women lost the vote. So we've covered the franchise, the voters, and so on. What? Just briefly, it's not quite a yes or no, but were elections a complete formality? Like, could, in theory, anyone could stand, presumably, anyone who's entitled to stand can stand.
Yes.
In theory, the voters can decline to vote for the bigwigs' favourite candidates, but in practice...
No, you'd have to be, of course, you'd have to be a head of household, and you'd have to be over 21. But that still leaves, 100,000 people at least who have the right to exercise the vote. By the way,
but what do you think? Are elections just a formality?
Not necessarily. Some of them are. I mean, somewhere like Old Sarum, where two bigwigs own all of the burgages, then it's a done deal, pretty much.
What percentage of elections actually get contested at all?
It's anywhere between... Before the Civil War, after the Civil War, politics starts to rear its ugly heads,
right.
And you get people standing on party tickets.
Right.
And so contested elections become a lot more common then.
Okay.
But even before the Civil War, it was quite normal for 30 or 40 of, say, 200 constituencies to have a contested election. And in the 1620s, which were quite a contentious era themselves, that goes up to maybe 70 or 80 constituencies that have a contested election.
I mean, in some ways, of course, today we might say, well, now we have free elections and anyone can stand as long as they can get the 10 subscribers and the deposit. But of course, in practice,
nobody votes for them.
Well, in practice, if you don't belong to a big party which is well funded, you're very unlikely to get elected.
Yes.
So then so we've talked about the franchise and the choice, the choice of candidates. Just to clarify one thing, we've mentioned that every constituency has 2 MPs.
Almost every constituency, right? Yes. Just a handful don't.
Yeah, and everyone has 2 votes.
Yes, if you belong to a constituency, you will get the vote to vote for 2 candidates at an election, not just one.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not just.
And of course, if you own property in several different places, you might have the votes in several different places.
So it's not you vote once and it's the 2 highest polling candidates. It's you have 2 votes.
Yes.
And of course, as you said, we don't have formal political parties in this era. No. But later on, when parties develop, potentially you could vote for 2 candidates from 2 different parties.
Oh yes, you could. That's called splitting.
Right.
Or if you wanted to vote for one party, but you thought one of the candidates was an idiot, you could just vote for the other one. That's called plumping.
So you only use one of your votes.
Yes, that's
in that
right.
Case. Right. Okay. Really interesting. That's really interesting sort of way of doing it. I wonder what would happen if that was applied now.
So do we all.
It's an interesting, it's not PR and it's not the alternative vote, but it is not quite first past the post either. So, yeah, right. Interesting.
First and second past the post.
Okay. Now, the other thing is, how did elections actually happen? Because, I mean, we know how it is now, right? You turn up at the polling station, you get your little card, you put your X in the box. It's all very secret. No one's supposed to know how you vote. Yeah. If anyone asks you, you can shake your finger at them and say secret ballot, secret ballot. Okay, but how did it work then?
It's very different. It's a very public affair. It needs to be a public affair because if you're standing for election, you want the endorsement of your wider community. That's the reason why you're in the Commons. You don't have a peerage, therefore you have to have the endorsement of a wider community of some sort. Now, elections were, again under 15th century statute, elections were required to be held between the hours of 8 and 11 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
At a conventional place, though that did sometimes change. Denbighshire alternated between one election was held in Denbigh on the western side of the county, and the next one was held in Wrexham on the eastern side of the county.
Okay. But generally it's held in the morning in a particular place.
In the morning in a particular place. And usually everyone will know about that. There were a few exceptions.
Okay.
They were always sharp practice.
Yes,
in Norfolk, the sheriff wanted to get his nephew elected, and so he had the county court convened in Norwich, as it usually was, by his deputy, his undersheriff, at 8 o'clock, and he adjourned it to Thetford, which is about 20 miles away. You'd be hard-pressed, even in a fast car now, you'd be hard-pressed to get to Thetford in time, because half an hour later, the sheriff reconvened the county court at Thetford and duly declared his nephew and a friend elected.
Right. Lovely. So they would be held in a particular place at a particular time.
Yes.
And what would happen?
Well, more often than not, before the Civil War, more often than not, there would be two candidates. So everyone would go huzzah and shout those candidates' names. When asked what the names of the candidates were, they would shout their names, and the sheriff would say, "Okay, so and so and so and so are duly elected."
Great.
On the other hand, or the other returning officer, it was a borough constituency. On the other hand, if you had more than two candidates, and this was generally regarded as something of misfortune, if you had more than two candidates, there was a very quickly accepted procedure about how to do this. The first thing was that you would hold a cry.
Okay.
Because don't forget, all the electorate will be mixed up together, and probably with hangers-on and spectators and tourists and God knows what. And you'd hold the cry, and you'd have a chance to shout for your candidates, and you'd shout lustily, "A Savile, a Savile," or "A Wentworth, a Wentworth,"
right,
as happened in the Yorkshire election in 1620. And if it was obvious at that stage, this is all trying to get the thing over with quickly, of course, because people may have travelled a long distance, they may want to get off home soon. So if it was obvious from the cry that one side had far more people than the other, then the sheriff would duly declare those two candidates for
time,
and that would be fine. If you didn't have a decision, if there was just a lot of shouting going on, you say, okay, we'll hold a view.
Okay. Yes.
Which means, all of you who are supporting these two candidates go over there, and all of you who support those candidates go over there.
Right.
That was fine. Normally, there'd be a lot of pushing and shoving. It might take like 20 minutes, half an hour if it's a big electorate. Yep. But you would, if you had a clear-cut result, if there were huge numbers for one candidate, one pair, then you say, okay, fine, that's it. I'm decided that's enough. Sometimes, of course, this is why the returning officer is a crucial electoral official, is because it is his decision and his decision alone. Though you can prosecute him if you disagree, you can prosecute him in a court of law, and later on, from 1621 onwards, the Commons takes over judging its own election returns, and there are endless hearings at the beginning of a parliament about people who figure they've been hard done by.
Okay.
And if the view doesn't work, then you go to the poll, which is where you have to get some of your unluckiest servants sitting down with, and this is at the county elections, it's very simple. You're the sheriff, you've got the list of county freeholders who are eligible to sit on a jury at the assizes. Yeah. And so you sit there and you call them one by one, and there may be thousands.
Yep.
You call it one by one, and you ask who they are.
Yep.
And they say so-and-so, and you find them on the list if you can, and if they can't find them on the list, but anyway, what you have a guard against fraud, such as it is, in that the sheriff's officers are entitled to administer an oath to people to swear
who they
are, and that they own that freehold land worth 40 shillings in the county,
right,
or whatever the bogus property is in town.
Yeah.
So this, of course, will take quite a lot of time. It could take 2 or 3 or 4 days. Which, if you're already looking at, say, a couple of days to get home in a big county like Norfolk or Devon or Yorkshire, that's you're taking more than a chunk week out of your working life.
Yeah,
basically.
so big. It's a big commitment. Basically.
Yes, it is. And that's the way it works. I mean, of course, the smaller constituencies, it's much easier.
Because only a few dozen voters.
You've got 9 voters
It's not going to take long.
It's not going to take very long. Though, actually, interestingly, in Albury in Yorkshire in 1628, 11 people signed the election return. There were only 9 burgages, but 11 people signed the return. Turned out 2 of them were tenants in the property, and they thought they'd come along, and as they were only 2 candidates, they said, "All right, fine, you can sign it as well."
Okay, because it wasn't a contested election.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, we spent quite a lot of time actually talking about how elections work in general. There were a couple of particular elections that you wanted to tell about because they're sort of particularly good examples of what could happen.
Now, I wouldn't want to encourage people to go out and contest elections because they're, slippery slope, really. But we do know so much more about electoral politics because of what happens when things go wrong.
And wrong in this context can simply mean more candidates than seats in a borough.
Yes, that is the definition
of going wrong.
Yeah.
That's when the sheriff starts to have a bad day.
Yes, actually, the ones most prone to these contested elections are medium-sized boroughs, which don't have a dominant interest, but where lots of the local gentry think they might get their oar in there.
So anyway, so the election was it Yorkshire?
Well, I ought to mention Denbighshire in 1601.
Okay, so Denbighshire 1601.
Where there were 2 local families who were at loggerheads for various reasons I won't go into now, but they both very, very strongly wanted to get elected.
Right.
And they turned up. There was only 1 county seat available in Wales, for each shire in Wales, which is the problem. If there were 2, you see, the 2 rival groups could have had 1 each, but in Wales they can't.
Just to be clear, English counties get 2 each, Welsh counties only 1.
Yes, it's unfair, isn't it?
Okay.
Sorry. But anyway, they turn up, and one side musters the local militia, which is going to threaten problems because when you've got a lot of stroppy armed people wandering around, it could cause problems. And the other side brought a whole load of toughs along themselves. And what happened was that there was basically a gigantic brawl involving 200 or 300 people in Wrexham churchyard. And the sheriff, very sensibly, decided that before anybody got themselves killed, he would call the election off.
Right.
So he did. And in fact, the county only finally elected its members 3 days before the dissolution.
Oh, okay.
So basically Denbighshire was not represented in that particular parliament.
Well, if you behave badly, there are consequences.
There we are, precisely. Now, one of the most famous contested elections of the early 17th century is in Yorkshire in 1621. Well, actually, the election happened in December 1620, but the Parliament didn't meet till the following year.
Okay.
Where Sir John Savile was one of the great local gentlemen, big property owner around the West Riding. And he was also very popular with the clothiers of the West Riding, the cloth manufacturers, the weavers, who are very powerful because they have life tenure on the Duchy of Lancaster's vast estates in the area.
So basically, Sir John Savile should be a shoo-in.
Yes, Sir John Savile is the steward of the Duchy of Lancaster properties.
So he should be a shoo-in.
He should be an absolute shoo-in. He
Okay,
certainly
but what
had been.
happens?
But an upstart young man by the name of Thomas Wentworth comes along, Sir Thomas Wentworth, and he decides that he fancies a pop himself, and not only that, he persuades Secretary of State Sir George Calvert down in London that, oh yes, he can get him elected for as Knight of the Shire with Wentworth. Now, because Calvert has recently bought a small property in Yorkshire, and he rather fancies the idea of being a Knight of the Shire. It is almost invariably more prestigious when you're in the Commons to speak as a Knight of the Shire, because you are going to speak for hundreds or thousands of people in that case.
So there's more prestige in being a Knight of the Shire than most borough MPs. Okay, so Wentworth decides to throw a spanner in Savile's works.
He does,
and he does this with his election. His partner candidate, George Calvert,
very hard among the gentry of the North and East Ridings. He also even actually has a damn good go at lobbying in the West Riding. He tries to subvert some of Savile's supporters, not with that much success, but nonetheless, he tries very hard.
How very modern of him.
Absolutely.
Right.
And they, shades of 2024 indeed.
Anyway.
And they... he prepares the ground very, very well. We have a lot of his letters. Sadly, we don't have hardly any letters from Savile.
We actually have Wentworth's letters.
We have several dozen letters from Wentworth to his friends and allies, talking tactics about how to deal with the election.
Wow.
And
Okay.
now, unfortunately, the election was held on the next county court day after the writ arrived, which was, as it happens, on Christmas Day.
Oh, right. Okay, as you do.
Which is, after all, going to be a problem because most people would rather be somewhere else on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
So he is well aware of this. He hires some rooms and some bedding and lays in a huge amount of food and beer and some wine for the gentlemen, of course.
Sorry, just check. Isn't that treating the voters?
Yes, but it's not actually. You're not paying for their votes. You're just, as he said in one of his letters. He said, "Well, I'm asking them to come a long way on Christmas Day. I hope they will have a Christmas pie with me."
Right. Okay.
And he also, on the day before the election, he arranges that his supporters are going to meet at Tadcaster, which is about 5 miles southwest of York, so that they can all march in together as a phalanx into York on Christmas Eve.
Right.
And so any wavering voters will find themselves influenced by the massive influx of the Wentworth voters.
Right. Is this called getting the vote out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, this is the pull in modern parlance.
Yep.
So he duly does this. Anyway, the county court convenes 8 o'clock the next morning.
Yeah.
And the sheriff is understandably just a little bit nervous about the occasion, because he knows, given how much these two candidates, Wentworth and Savile, loathe each other, he knows there's almost certainly going to be an election petition, and he might actually end up being punished by the House of Commons.
Right.
So they get all in. The election is traditionally held in the grounds of York Castle. You can still go there. It can fit several thousand people. It's a bit of squash.
So they all get into York Castle.
And there's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people.
Right.
I don't
Okay.
know. But he has the cry.
He has the cry.
Totally inconclusive.
Right. He has the view.
He then has the view, and it looks like Savile might have more people, but it went with protests that actually that's because they got a lot of hangers-on with them there, like
who aren't actual
pie
voters.
sellers and women and,
who aren't actual voters.
Who aren't actual voters, that's right.
So he has to move on to the...
So he goes on to the poll.
Right.
And this...
He's having a really bad Christmas.
With an electorate running into thousands... This is going to take several days.
Yeah.
It would almost certainly have taken 3 4 days.
Wentworth's thought of that, though, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. He's got all his goodies in precisely.
Yeah.
That's why you've got to have lodging for people.
Yeah.
They may have walked 40 miles to
they
be
won't
there.
be called till day 3 or something. Yeah. Okay. And
so that's another reason why you have to do that.
Yeah.
It was possible. We know in the Cambridgeshire election of 1624. The Cambridgeshire by-election of March 1624, that the various rival candidates ran up tavern bills of nearly £400.
Wow.
That was for a much smaller election than Yorkshire.
So, but keeping to Yorkshire in 1620. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so then they start counting. The sheriff's clerks sit down and obviously despairing of this job. They probably have much better places to be, and they start counting, and each and you can do. There are all sorts of sharp practices. We know we know from some elections that, for instance, if you were worried that your vote wasn't quite big enough, you would go along the queue of your voters and you would offer them 40 shillings for their freehold, which would mean they could legitimately, when they were placed under oath, they could legitimately say, yes, my freehold is worth 40 shillings. Why? Somebody just offered me
40 shillings.
Offered me for it, yes.
Right.
So, there were all sorts
lucky
of
they didn't have postal votes as well.
Well, quite. But anyway, there was, not surprisingly, with some thousands of people milling around there, nobody actually quite knew what was happening. Well, about 3 people did, and most of them were saying, "What the hell is happening?" And also some of Savile's supporters may have turned up late or may have gone away to get some refreshments, and then they came back to find the gate of the castle yard locked against them, and so some of his other supporters in the castle yard then went and broke the gates open, and the sheriff said, "Oh well, that's it. I got to abandon the election because obviously we don't know. You have to have been there. You have to have been there since 8 o'clock for your vote to count. You can't just turn up late." And so he said, "Okay, I'm abandoning this count, and I declare Calvert and Wentworth elected. There was, of course, inevitably a protest, and there was a fresh election held about 6 weeks later.
Oh my goodness.
Wentworth luckily got away without being punished for any of his sharp practice, but there was a vote held 6 weeks later, which in fact confirmed the result. And they did take what we're told is a long and tedious poll.
So what exactly would have been considered sharp practice? The getting in the bedding and the drink, or just the shenanigans with the castle?
No, what the Commons actually came down heaviest on, they didn't really want to punish the best friend of the Secretary of State, Sir George Calvert, or really Savile either, who's a very big worthy, and had been sheriff in his time. What they do is, in the end, they discover Wentworth had politely written. He's very careful with words, Wentworth. He'd written to all of the high constables of the local wapentakes, the sub areas of the county, and he'd asked them to ask the voters if they would turn out to vote for him and Secretary Calvert on election day. But he'd asked them. That's the crucial thing. Two of the constables didn't quite get the subtlety of that language, and they said they used the usual the usual phrase that was in any sort of writ. They will and require you to turn out, and so it's the poor high constables that get spanked.
Right? Gosh. But in the end, they get a result, which is ruled to have been fair, despite.
Well, no, it's not ruled to be fair. Savile complains, it's overturned, but then they hold another election. The sheriff does it absolutely by the book.
Yeah. Okay. Right. And Wentworth was not quite breaking the rules, but he was treading a fine line.
When you're supposed not to play politics, how do you not play politics in a contested election? It's actually virtually impossible not play politics. For instance, we know that there are several constituencies where we know people actually canvass the voters assiduously,
but they just pretend that they're not really.
But they pretend that it's not happening really.
Yeah, because there was still a kind of convention that you don't canvass. Yeah. Okay. Right. So anyway, elections in the early 17th century were nothing if not colourful.
They could be.
So they were either completely dull, or they were extremely colourful, you might say.
Oh, you
have the full gamut.
Even the dull ones weren't necessarily dull. I mean, apart from anything, it was a good day out for everybody, wasn't it? Or in the case of a really small constituency like Albury, it was a good half an hour out anyway. Yeah.
The last question, which in a way is a huge question, so I'm being very mean to ask you to answer it briefly, is this system defensible? I mean, because it's one of those things where it's really easy for it just to become another kind of slightly smug pat on the back about how wonderful we are now, that we have free and fair representative democracy, and wasn't everything in the past all a bit of a disgraceful stitch up. But can we? Is that it, or can we defend the system? Can we say that it is, in its way, an attempt at fair government of a free people?
I think you can defend this system fairly easily, actually. It is a system that is not predicated on getting the maximum number of votes. It is predicated on getting a fair and equitable representation of the vast range of interests that preoccupy the people who are governing the country. It is all about giving the elites of the country a say in the government of that country, and it is fairly effective at that. I don't think it's much less effective than the situation we have today. The other thing is also that today, of course, in safe seats, of which there may not be many left a few weeks' time, but no, in safe seats, the electorate is really only in the hands of the constituency association of the
whichever party
ruling party, which selects the MP.
And just as a final, very broad question, which of course is, there are many people who don't vote at all, right?
Yes.
Despite the franchise being wider than you might think, there are many people who don't vote. Now, so is this just a stitch-up whereby the non-voting, 3/4, 9/10 are simply downtrodden, starving, and treated like slaves? Or is it, can we not write it off quite that simply?
Well, I think that anybody who, you don't have to be interested in politics 400 years ago to be interested in elections, because Parliament almost certainly will be pressed to vote quite a lot of money for whatever purpose it might be this year. And if you're a taxpayer, and the 40 shilling freehold franchise is about taxpayers, then you will want some sort of say over that.
Yeah.
You will also want, of course, and this is like today. You also want somebody you know and trust.
But also, in a way, the people who are, as you say, part of the elite interest can't run the place with no reference to what's good for everyone else, because in that case the place simply won't run.
Yes, that's quite right. And when you consider also that if you take heads of household as the key indicator, rather than people individually, heads of household, then approximately a third of English male heads of household could expect to hold some public office during the course of their lives. It might be Lord Mayor of London, it might be ale taster in your local two-horse borough, but nonetheless you could expect to hold some sort of public office and be held accountable for your conduct and expenditure while in office.
So in of course this is a subject for another day, but in some ways we can't limit participation in certainly in local government to parliamentary elections.
No, not at all. It's very much only one relatively small part of the equation. Most people would never expect to go to Parliament. Frankly, they wouldn't want the expense of going to Parliament. Because the 2 shillings and 6pence a day does not cover it.
Yeah. So Parliament is an important part of the equation, but not the only equation in, the government of England and the government of England and the keeping of the King's peace, as we used to call it. Okay. Well, thank you for this really interesting conversation. It's been long but fun.
Thank you for having me. Do I get travel expenses now?
Okay, so elections from 1600 to 2024. The more that changes, the more stays the same. Thank you.